Let us now sing the Philippine national anthem.
Sa langit mo pagkaw,
Welcome to Philippine Nostalgia and Japanese TV. Voltes 5 Atiba pa. This webinar is presented to you by the Phoenix's Arts and Culture Committee. Let us now call on our MC for today's webinar, Miss Sonny Aguilar.
Good afternoon, everyone. For now, let's take time off from work from home, but stick to your monitors as the Phoenix Arts and Culture Committee will enthuse you again for a delightful afternoon on animation, specifically robots. Not the speaker, as human as he is, but the phenomenon that had occurred in the late 70s. I am referring to something that had become a craze and possibly which could have jump-started the animation of superheroes that our young members, especially our junior Phoenix, would be delighted to know more about. Why was it significant? Before we begin, let's start our afternoon with gratitude, with an invocation from our newest member, Attorney Jing Arellano.
Let us put ourselves in the presence of God. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for gathering us this afternoon. We are grateful that we are here in our present, able to spend time with each other and to have another opportunity to learn. All of these because of your blessings and almighty will. We ask your forgiveness for all our transgressions and weaknesses, for forgetting that everything we are and everything we have is because of you. We seek your grace and inspiration that we will have a memorable and meaningful event this afternoon with lifted spirits and youthful hearts. Deliver us and our loved ones from all sufferings and pains, from all worries and troubles, and strengthen our bodies, minds, and hearts, especially this most difficult time. Remind us that everything we do here, all the things we will accomplish, is for your greater glory. We ask these in Jesus' name. Amen.
Holy Spirit. Beautiful and heartfelt. Thank you, Jing. To deliver the welcome remarks and the introduction of our speaker, let me call in our liaison director, Mr. Domeng Go.
Thank you, Sonny. Colleagues in Phoenix, friends, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar of the Phoenix Arts and Culture Committee, where we explore a form of popular art that has had an influence on our society, both children and adults alike. For many of us who love Japan, we know that one of its greatest contributions is the introduction of anime, a term derived from the English word animation and used to refer to cartoons in Japan. Although profoundly influenced by Western models, Japanese animation has developed a distinctive visual style and a range, artistic, dramatic, and perhaps unparalleled in subject matter. Anime took off as a creative form, especially in the 1960s, when animation became a centerpiece in the young medium of television. And today, it is hugely successful, not only in Japan, but also beyond, extending its popularity and influence to other countries. Japanese culture can be seen in many anime TV shows, and popular anime characters can be seen all over Japan on toys, t-shirts, accessories, and stationaries. Even restaurants create their own anime-style characters to promote their products, such as children's meals. The generation of today recognized that the early 1990s served as what was known as the anime boom, such that anime culture further evolved when anime conventions started taking place. In the Philippines, many may have forgotten that there was one anime show that was extremely popular a little more than 40 years ago, when it was aired locally in the 70s. It evolved around the classic story of good versus evil, or the theme of resistance and rebellion. And it did not take long for the show to become every kid's obsession, such that pretty soon, The opening theme song of the show lived on in children's toys, cell phone ringtones, and all kinds of merchandise. That is, until its airing was abruptly halted in 1979. Eventually, the show was re-aired on Philippine television from 1990 to 2010s with a Filipino dub. This afternoon, we are fortunate to have with us our speaker who will tell us more about the show and how it has influenced aspects of our own cultural development. An assistant professor of the Department of History and a former director of the Japanese Studies program of the Ateneo de Manila University, where he finished his AB Interdisciplinary Studies degree, he has authored COVID-19 and Popular Culture in Southeast Asia, Digital Responses to the Pandemic for the COVID Chronicle series of the Kyoto University Center for Southeast Asian Studies, and Japanese Representation in Philippine Media as a section of the Palgrave Handbook of Ethnicity. He obtained his MA in Japanese Studies from the National University of Singapore and his PhD in Social Sciences from Hitotsubashi University in Japan. He has been an Asia Public Intellectual Junior Fellow and is presently a Japan Foundation Japanese Studies Fellow. He is currently a part of the editorial board of the Social Sciences Diliman and the East Asian Journal of Popular Culture, as well as a steering committee member of the Japanese Studies Association of Southeast Asia. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our speaker this afternoon, Dr. Carl Ian Hui Cheng Chua. Dr. Carl, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I do appreciate the invitation from Phoenix to give this talk, so allow me to share my screen. I'd first like to acknowledge that part of this talk is part of a paper that I have co-written with Dr. Herb Fontevilla in Japan. So let's start with the obvious. In 2019, Philippine Star in Facebook actually shared in the celebration of Martial Law, one of these screens on, and it basically gives you the nuance of how Voltes 5 has been connected to Philippine history. And what I will do is not necessarily show you anything new, but I hopefully would like to add to the interpretations of this, particularly since I'm coming from a Japanese studies perspective. So I'll be between the Philippines and Japan in either situation. So why Philippine nostalgia and Japanese TV, given that, of course, Voltes 5, particularly to people who watched it, would echo nostalgia to us, especially since anime, when Voltes 5 was actually shown, was not yet a familiar term for our audiences. So to begin, back in 2016 in Japan, Fuji Televi's Mezamashi Terebi actually went around the street. If you're familiar with Japanese television shows, they would do this. And would interview tourists about their country's popular anime song. So they'd go around and ask tourists what their most popular animation song was, and it was quite surprising that for all the Filipinos that that they actually interviewed, 80 all of them actually mentioned Voltes 5, which then became a very, very surprising thing for the Japanese. Why? Because Voltes 5 was not a popular anime during that time, nor was it actually a relevant anime on their end. So it was quite surprising. They were probably expecting something like Doraemon, Candy Candy, or anything that was at least popular within their own spaces. And hence, it was unusual for to have Filipinos actually cite this rarely heard of anime. Why? I'll give you what you now see here are the data concerning the average viewer percentage. The highest in anime history was charted with Astro Boy at 40.3% when it was shown. Then you have Sazae-san. Then you have Hoshi. then Rupan, then Mazinger Z, which was also a show that was shown in the same period as Voltes 5 in the Philippines, was actually quite so. So it was quite unusual that we actually picked up with Voltes, particularly that in the local space it was not actually popular to them. And on our end, we were able to first see Voltes 5 when it was first aired in GMA in GMA on May 5, 1978. But why are we familiar with this? Not that I've actually watched it in its first show. The curiosity here is that it was an anime that was constantly repeated in various generations, and hence the nostalgia that we have for it would span multi-generations. And in the Philippines, it was quite surprising that compared to its Japanese rating, we had an annual of 58%. So that was a quite interesting feat, at least in our studies. So first one to look at it from a Japanese perspective is to look at it from the idea of Kokuhan. To those who are familiar with the study, especially with anime, it's basically Japan's our policy in sort of winning over winning over people towards Japanese culture, as opposed to hard power. But the problem with this is that the soft power policy would only be implemented in 2002, and this is a 1970s anime. So hence, this was not even part and parcel of Japanese concept. Nonetheless, in the 90s, when Filipinos were studying this, and this sort of soft power concept was still cool for academics, it was sort of attested to Voltes 5's popularity. So just to give you a history on how many times Voltes 5 was actually shown, we have first GMA in 1978. Then, because it would be canceled, we'll talk about that in a bit, it was later shown in PTV4 in 1986. Then in ABS-CBN in 1989. And in IBC 13 and RPN 9. Then it would then again be reshown in GMA 1999, and the Filipino dub would be shown in GMA again on December 1999. When cable was still popular then, cable channel Hero TV screened a redubbing and a renamed series of Voltes 5 called Voltes 5 Evolution in 2015. And then we would have another redubbing in Filipino in GMA in 2017. And finally, the streaming company iFlix, I'm not sure if it's still being used now, but hopefully it is, offered an on-demand service for both English and Filipino dubs of Voltes 5. So in other words, what you see here is not just the nostalgia of people in the 1970s, 1980s, but you also have 1990s children and even our present generation now having a taste or a glimpse of Voltes 5 itself. So why is this interesting, and why should we study? Why am I actually part of this paper? Why am I studying this? Part of the popularity of the medium was began with a trend in the Philippines when television or personal television sets became actually ubiquitous. Even before this, if you notice, in the 1960s, only 2% of the population, or only 0.02% of the population owned television sets, because television sets during that time was really expensive, costing there in the dollar frame, $39,000 US. It's quite ridiculous, right? No, that's what they're earning. Sorry about that. But 10 years later, what you then see here is a massive increase in ownership. In other words, in the Philippines, from in a decade, we actually had a rise of 0.39. This is not significant then, but it's actually significant when you talk about viewership, particularly when you're looking at the 1970s, when people were actually sharing television sets, especially to those that were owning during the time. So the more people the more people who own these personal television sets, the more people were now sharing and watching this media, and it allowed for people to actually have um, massive massive cultural consumption. So which now leads us to a total of about 81% viewership in TV. But this becomes a problem. We did have a surge in television ownership, but this created a problem towards what they were now showing or what they were now seeing. Television channels had difficulty filling up their programming, particularly because of the expensive costs of production. In the old business model for television, what happened was the television channel was in charge of doing the programming, which included concepts of TV shows, the casting of them, and of course allocating them into time slots. And of course, during this time in the 70s, we did have I've watched rep, showings of this, such as John and Marcia and Kapwa Ko Mahal Ko in the provinces. So in other words, it doesn't mean that we didn't have local shows. It just meant that it was quite expensive to produce them. And hence, what television channels did was introduce an American business model called block timing. In other words, what they did was they actually sold blocks or chunks of time in television to private industries who are now obligated to fill in these slots. And why is this going to be attractive to them? Something that is a bane and a boon, depending on which part of the business model you are. They're actually able to earn income through advertising. So they buy a chunk, then they sell this chunk with advertisers and re-earn their money from it based on the viewership of the shows that they were then looking at. So what happens? Block timers are now filling it up with popular and cheap production. And just to give you an idea of how much a block time would cost, the US one block time would actually be around 500,000 US dollars. South Korea was around 200,000. And in the Philippines, it's cheap, but it's still expensive, around 130 for a block time. So in other words, one of these companies would buy this block time, purchase content for it, and then re-earn their income based on what they were, how much they're going to sell, like a 1 minute, a 2 minute slot in these chunks. So, to those who are familiar with the history of Voltes 5, we now go to one of these block timers. It used to be known as Quester Productions, owned by Larry Chan. Currently, it's now registered as Telesuccess Productions. Larry Chan was not actually a block timer himself, but rather his business was primarily in car dealership. But because a lot of cars were actually produced in Japan, he was also then able to see and experience a lot of this anime. And he was quite curious to actually import it in the Philippines, particularly since Japanese anime was very cheap. Why is Japanese anime cheap? It was cheaper because the animation production for Japanese anime is quite cheap. In other words, they actually they only draw very small the number of panels that they would draw for the animation, I'm sorry, I forget my terms here, was quite limited, as opposed to American animation then. And that was why, in terms of production, Japanese animation is actually quite cheaper. So he brought a bulk of it in. Um, he brought a bulk of it in and try and sold it to GMA. But in this situation, it became a very tough choice, considering that Japan wasn't really used to international markets then. And what the Japanese companies did was to also unload a lot of unpopular anime. So in other words, they were trying to sell premium content at a premium price, but as a omake or parang bonus na lang. They were also then adding on some other content that they could not actually sell in their own markets. And hence, during this time, Questor was actually able to purchase around 5 anime. So why I'm saying it's not at iba pa, because it's quite surprising in terms of our nostalgia. We don't remember the others. The block time that was purchased by Questor was a very appropriate time when adults can actually watch, but at the same time, it was the period when children were just coming home from school. So it was a very popular time slot. And they purchased the block time for the weekdays. Hence, you had the programming of Mekander Robo on Monday, Daimos on Tuesday, Mazinger Z on Wednesday, UFO Robo Grandizer on Thursday, and Voltes 5 on Friday. So one of the possible reasons why Voltes 5 was actually popular was because it was on a Friday slot and there were no classes the day after. And hence, there was not much policing by parents in terms of me allowing them to watch, as opposed to the other weekday slots. But of course, we have yet to see whether this is true or not. But it didn't mean that purchasing the anime itself, was actually cheap, because they were purchasing it raw. In other words, they were purchasing it with no subs and no translated transcripts. So what Questor did, which becomes a model in subbing in dubbing and subbing in the 90s, was to then have a lot of in-house dubbing. And that's where we then see the development of Filipino voice actors. So in other words, if you see here, this is supposed to be the model for the companies themselves, the Japanese companies, in the present time, when they realize that they have an international market. But in the local situation, during that time, they had to just sell the material raw, right? And it allowed for this new development, at least in the Philippine spaces. All right. And so what happens? Given that we got it raw, one of the problems that existed here was for Questor to then translate the entire script into English. They chose English because they realized that not a lot of Filipinos, particularly in the provinces, would be able to understand Filipino well. The national language law, I think, was not yet passed during that time, and hence they changed. They were refusing to use the actual Japanese names, considering that it was not actually attractive. And if it was foreign, a lot of Filipinos would tend to actually reject this type of nuance. And hence, a lot of the character, not only was Shodenji Machine Voltes 5 then translated into just Voltes 5, you also had the character names just translated into English. And that's why to those that are in the 1970s, 80s, and probably as late as the 90s, we never knew that Steve Armstrong's name is actually Go Kenichi, but we would still remember them as the Armstrongs, Big Bert, Little John, and so on, right? So what does this mean? This further pushes the idea that Cool Japan was not actually a thing during this time, because the viewers during this period were also clueless of the fact that they were actually watching Japanese anime. In most situations, a lot of the children during these times were thinking that this is probably part of the offshoots of American animation. And that's the hint towards the Americanized names. Furthermore, a lot of the cartoons that we had during this time was actually imported from America. Even a lot of the anime that we got from Toei during that period were actually translated from the US and then re-exported to us back here. Right. So where are we with this? Going back to martial law, as we're currently celebrating it, there is the myth that has been mentioned by Ma'am Soni, that one of the reasons why we have a strong nostalgia towards Voltes 5 was because of the censorship that was imposed by then President Ferdinand Marcos, I'm so sorry, on September 3 to 7, 1979. The idea there was, if you're familiar with the story, it's a good against a tyrannical evil. There was an advice that stated that they were going to, inspire Filipinos to overturn the dictatorship. That was one of the narratives that was imposed. However, when public historian Xiao Chua was writing about this in his blog, one of the original voice actresses, the voice actress for Jamie, actually commented to Xiao Chua that it wasn't actually, I don't think it was because of the complaint by Marcos, but rather it was a complaint by Polly Cayetano, an elite woman who is also an artist or an actress during that time, and who led the Catholic Women's League of the Philippines during this period. And during that time, the Catholic Women's League thought that the content in a lot of these anime, not only Voltes 5, but all of the animation shows were extremely violent, that she petitioned to then President Ferdinand Marcos to have the anime censored, or at least taken off air, right? And this could have been a possible narrative, if you have heard of it, considering that the Catholic Women's League is a very strong organization, and for Marcos wanting to have support, particularly during this very terrible time, he had fallen into pressure, according to some narratives, and had taken it off the screen. Another narrative that was also explained was the fact that because all of the TV channels during this time were not privately owned, except for GMA, as we have experienced in ABS-CBN in the current administration. Part of the reason, there's another narrative that stated that this was one way to vindicate GMA 7, particularly because it was airing a lot of negative press against the president then. So we have three nuances to why it was canceled. But one curiosity here is that the nostalgia to why Voltes 5 was taken off screen, with the Marcoses lived at least to the generation of the 1970s, especially since this generation did not finish the ending. I think closed two episodes or one episode before the entire anime ended, and hence a lot of the viewers were starving for it. And it was a good review that, post martial law, it was then shown, and people were now able to see what actually, how this actually ended. Nonetheless, a curiosity here, just as an afterthought, we would think that why is Polly Cayetano such a crazy person, right? And I don't know whether she's related to the Cayetanos now. In the 1990s, when Voltes 5 was re-aired in TV again, then former Davao Oriental Representative Joel Mayo Almario also petitioned for the censorship of Voltes 5 once again. But once again, I think during this time, it was a more slightly more lax space, and hence it wasn't listened to during that period. But it gives you a nuance to how our cultural products are actually being gatekept during this time. So it was quite fascinating that when I post this talk to the Phoenix members, a lot of them were like, "What? What the hell is this? Why are you talking about this? What's its relevance?" And as a person that actually studies popular culture, what I wanted to present was the idea that popular culture has influence in the same way that soft power actually has influence. It's not immediate, but eventually it will have an influence to people who have resonance to it. And during that time, in its popularity in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, what we will then have are products that were then merchandise that were then trying to capitulate to the popularity of this brand. And hence, I remember this in my generation, techs would sell a lot of these Voltes 5 decks, and we would buy them, we would collect them because we loved them. During that time when I was a child, stickers were also a thing, and hence we would save money just to buy stickers or even pencil cases and so on. So this sort of resonates to, if you're familiar with anime studies media mix, where a particular cultural content would then try to expand its lifestyle through other devices, and hence you extend its storyline beyond what its narrative tells you. But it's not only to this generation. There was also a local translation of comics, and hence it moves from one medium to another. Furthermore, we have also Giordano, which, if I recall, for 2 seasons had launched their Voltes 5 line. I can't recall the dates, but I do know that this is not in the immediate outlay. It's probably in the 2000s or the 90s. And this is basically echoing to the nostalgia of the children of the 70s and 80s. And they were buying them as a collector's edition. To the older children right now, there's also the Funko Pop Voltes 5, which becomes a collector's edition, at least in the Philippine space, particularly since it's a fandom for us. So in other words, at least within our own spaces, we're not only consuming the TV show, we are re-consuming it, reinvesting, well, not reinvesting, but spending our money on multiple products just to actually show our fandom or our love for this product itself. But how popular was Voltes 5? It was actually a very large cultural phenomenon that in the 1978, Tito Vic and Joey, then young comedians recognized this trend and they released an LP parodying what you saw in your early show. This is an LP for their. This is a title LP for them. Surgeon Pepe. And I'll just show you the 3-minute video of it. Apologies for the bad video because the 1978 MTV during this time.
Naintindihan niyo na? Eh, ano masasabi po sa tambalang Roel de la Rosa Rosales? Ano masasabi mo tungkol sa divorce?
Basta, Mortified ako.
Real Moreno?
Mortified.
Mortified? Pagdating ng araw at di na tayo kit. Pagdating ng pet, 1999, ang aking nangyari ang magkaroon natin din. Yan, sa driver ko ay payohonik. Peter Pan, Black Gordon, lagi kong nagay. Robot lang sa hinat, minat na yaw. Gordon 5, ang dito. Natin ako ng ang araw at tayo kit. United. Roger, Ramay. Ang third guy. Problema. Ya ay poder na.
Okay, so why I'm showing you this is it has not changed up to now, where a lot of our Filipino comedians, talents, even up to now would try to parody popular cultural contexts, right? And it was surprising that even something like an anime during the 1970s had actually inspired our Tito Vic and Joey to launch an LP about it. Especially during the time when anime was not even a common term during that time. Oh, sorry. This is from my generation. We would then also have retranslations of it, particularly given that anime was not also a common term. And hence, the only way to keep on making it be consumed in our own spaces is for cultural creators to then copy, reinterpret it, and reintroduce it in multiple ways, particularly since they don't need to do market research anymore. They know it's going to sell. So in funny comics of my childhood, they also had a copy of it called Voltec 5. And during that period, I would not have known that it is a copy of an anime, but I would have known that it's a copy of Voltes 5, and I would read it. Given that, it's Voltes 5 was a limited series. I've finished it, watching it from beginning to end, and I'm curious to actually know what other stories I can make with it, right? But it's not only in popular culture that you then see its influence, um, because of the myth narrative of martial law and Voltes 5. You had national artist Toym Imao, who then actually created these series of pieces called Lost Lust for forgotten episodes, aka San Montes 5, which was first, I think, if it was exhibited in UP Diliman, and I'm not sure where it is now. But in other words, we're not just looking at how I hate using the term low art has actually had influence, but how a cultural product actually had influences to people who were consuming it. And part of the rationale of Time Imao for actually creating these pieces was because of the memory he had about the martial law period, of his childhood, of the censorship of Voltes 5, and of the Marcoses. But it's not just in its past stages. We also see this now in the news. In last year, then famous or infamous PNP former PNP chief, Debold Sinas, who in the first showing in 1978 was 13 years old, actually watched Botes 5. And according to the Wikipedia, according to his Wikipedia item, was his favorite show. And we wouldn't have known that young Debold Sinas would eventually become a very important person when he grows up. So much so that when he became a police regional officer of the Central Visayas, he would then impose it as a training song for his training song for his for his um, uh, for his units, right, from 2018 to 2019. And later on, if you follow the news, he would also use it as the health program that they would have. The Voltes 5 theme would then be used by CNAS as a soundtrack for the training videos so that the PNP could be healthier in the present time, right? However, his interpretation of it was not the anti tyrannical concept, but the unity, the vaulting in of the Wantes 5. And hence for him, it was a strong message that he used to make the PNP work together and vault in as well. But it also shows you about how culture, or at least some form of culture, can actually influence particular spaces. um, Last couple of slides, what you saw in the beginning was how popular is Voltes 5 to us now. In 2020, in 2020, there was already rumors about the Philippines doing a live action Voltes 5, our own interpretation of it, which was going to be produced by, of course, GMA 7. They began filming last year, but they stopped production. No, they began filming as early as May 2021, but they stopped because of COVID. And we picked up a lot of this controversies with the writer as well. And hence what we have interpretations of it as Voltes 5. Great. Why is this important? We're not just looking at what you saw before, fans interpreting, acquiring, reinterpreting a cultural product, but you now have an industry that actually purchased a license, a very expensive license to exclusively make a live action of Voltes 5 within our own spaces. And I don't know if the license also includes redistribution. However, it's a quite interesting nuance for the Philippines because we're the only ones that actually found Voltes 5 popular, and we're expending so much to it. But why I'm actually saying that there's at iba pa, just to sort of not extend it more, the nuance of Voltes 5 and the purchasing of all of this content had allowed the beginning of importing a lot of anime into the Philippines, which then not only influences its consumers, but it then was part of our childhood, things that we never even thought were were anime, such as Flying House and Superbook, where then later on began a start that there's now this model of buying raw material from Japan, retranslating it, redubbing it, and then showing it in our own spaces. But it's not just anime. We also have tokusatsu. During my time, it was Mask Rider Black, but you also have things like Bioman, Ultraman, and so on, which will also have its own cultural trend. What made this particularly curious to me, and this will be my last slide, is this see
Ano sabi mo? Ka nga magulo dyan, tsaka mukha ka namang action star eh. Hindi nga ako marunong umarte, tapos patatamlingin mo ako. Puro kakalokohan eh. Tsaka tignan mo yung katawan mo, oh. Bagay naman sa'yo eh. Isipin mo lang parang naglalaro din. Nagsinungaling ka kasi sa boss mo. Eh paano pagdating doon sa shoot, di naman ako marunong umarte. Yun nga maganda doon eh. Wala kang linya dito. Naka-costume ka at saka naka-helmet.
So we do have all of these translations. Bustamante is basically an influence of the tokusatsu genre, which they then retranslated into a sort of story of migration, or Filipino migration into Japan itself. So when posed again by the question of the Phoenix members, like why is this significant in the Philippines, is because it does have influence into our cultures. And it doesn't mean that it has to be an immediate influence. It really depends on who was then consuming it, what they were consuming, how they were consuming it, and how they were interpreting it. And hence, the best example that we could see was the example of Votes 5, but it doesn't limit itself to that only. Nonetheless, what it just means is that we then can treat something like an anime seriously, particularly when we're trying to shape our own cultures in the Philippines. So thank you, and I do open the floor for questions and comments if there's some.
Thank you, Dr. Carl. I'm sure the talk has stirred quite a lot of questions from the audience, which our moderator will help us through. And by the way, our moderator is no ordinary fan. He's an expert in Japanese culture who will help us uncover more details about the subject through your questions. Dr. Benjamin A. San Jose is an assistant professor of Japanese Studies and Political Science at the Ateneo de Manila University. Dr. Ben received his PhD in International Public Policy from the University of Tsukuba, where his dissertation explored the role of nationalist discourses in shaping and promoting Philippine labor migration policies, of which his current research focuses on the use of migration management between our country and Japan. He teaches courses on international relations, public policy, and is also pursuing research on Japanese multiculturalism policies and Japan's changing public diplomacy in the Asian region. Dr. Ben, you have the floor.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Benjamin Sonesa from the Ateneo de Manila University. Thank you very much for the warm invitation from Phoenix, no, and for allowing me to engage with our speaker, Dr. Carl. So, so again, as moderator, what I'll just do is I'll just remind everyone, if you have questions, if you have some ideas or comments, feel free to write them in the chat box. And then later, no, we'll try to compile them. And then if we have the time, you can also use the emoji button for the raise hand as well. No, so if you want to express yourself verbally, no. But as moderator, my role is really to jumpstart the conversation, no, and for me, no, allow me to engage and to discuss some of the themes that I saw, no, at with Carl Sens's presentation. Okay, for those who are Japanese fans, no, whether you've been to Japan, whether you like anime, whether you like TV dramas, no, we all know how aesthetic really plays a big role in Japanese culture. Remember, if you watch, for example, YouTube videos, they would show amazing gift wrapping techniques or how they package their omiyage and pasalubong in such intricate ways. No, so aesthetic really plays a role in Japanese culture. However, there's a very interesting phrase that I'd like to share with the audience. No, it's a saying of sorts. No, which is the phrase "hanayori dango." No, so what does that mean? No, okay, it means choose rice cakes over flowers. No, so if you are given the choice, would you rather choose form, aesthetics, or substance? No, so for example, instead of thinking about what color shirt I'm going to wear, no, let's think about whether my arguments, whether my ideas are actually resonant to the audience, whether my um, the points I'd like to raise really engage with the discussions for today. No, so in this case, no, this dynamics, no, or dualism between form and substance is also present when we talk about Voltes 5. No, so in this case, it was already mentioned by Ma'am Sonia a while ago, and then by Mr. Domingo a while ago. It's really the idea of violence, no, versus the idea of subversion. I mean, Carl Sensi already mentioned how the Catholic Women's League really wanted the TV show to be canceled because of violence. But then we can't really dismiss it. I mean, as a Gen X millennial, and probably even those who are before me, attest to watching Voltes 5, it is really a violent show. I mean, if you compare it, for example, to Hanna-Barbera cartoons or G.I. Joe, remember every time they battled, they would pew, pew, they would use laser guns and whatnot. And then the spaceships would just explode and they would parachute safely. But in Voltes 5, I remember even in the second episode, no, which was really memorable for me, their mother was killed. No, she sacrificed herself to defend the children. And then afterwards, after the shock of having a anime brave enough to show death, you really saw the reaction of the Voltes 5 crew. No, they were really so angry. They were shocked. There was real hatred. And then how they destroyed and killed the robot was something else. It really was brutal. No, it was really scary. But no, when we talk about violence, no, there is a real context behind it as well. And this was what was already mentioned by Sir Domingo a while ago. No, it's also the idea of subversion. For those who haven't watched it or maybe forgot the themes, no, it's basically about Dr. Armstrong hiding that he is not actually an aristocrat, that even though he's the crown prince, he is not actually eligible to become the next king. Why? Because he's not Bosanian, he doesn't have a horn. And then, sorry, spoiler alert. And then what happened? No, basically his secret was suddenly um, was uncovered by his evil uncle, which became the new emperor, and then he now starts a rebellion, no, against this evil empire. No, so and even this idea, no, when you watch it and after rewatching it as an adult, you really also see the parallelisms, right? I mean, do you remember when we were kids, we used to watch the Ten Commandments during the Holy Week? It's basically Moses, no, discovering that he's actually a Jew and he's not part of the Pharaoh royal family. So there's really resonance when we talk about subversion versus violence. No, so with this idea of engaging with this idea of form versus substance, of violence versus subversiveness, I just have two questions that I'd like to raise to Carl Sense. No, he already mentioned this a while ago in his very interesting and lively presentation, but I'd like to take this opportunity for him to expound on it further. No? So the first question is about the whole idea of censorship, no, and about substance, no, of the messaging of Voltes 5. A while ago, you mentioned that there are two narratives. One narrative says that no, it's actually just violence, no, because of the influential Catholic Women's League, no, and it was attested by the testimony from the voice actress. And then the other narrative would show that, in fact, um, the Marcos regime canceled it because they discovered the subversive themes of Voltes 5. So I'd like to ask Carl Sense to expound on it further. What are some of the concrete historical evidence, not beyond testimonies? For example, um, can you lay the groundwork of what the political context of censorship during this time was? And if it was really violence, how come Voltes 5 was really chosen as the violent anime, and why not, for example, the other TV shows, no, whether it's cartoons or live action or whatnot? So can you for example compare it with other works during this time, no? So so basically it's about evidence, no, evidence of which of the narratives is more plausible. Okay, and then the second one is probably more related um, to the events, no, of the past few days, which is of course um, the announcement of Bongbong Marcos that he wants to run for the next elections, the the constant debate that we have about remembrance and the Marcos regime. So I'd like to return to that larger theme of nostalgia and remembrance. No, so of course we look when we talk about nostalgia, no, it's defined as basically looking and remembering the past, but then often forgetting the more not so pretty parts of the past, no? So in this case, when we talk about nostalgia, no, how do we connect nostalgia for Voltes 5, no, and the other side, which is how we actually remember censorship, no, and um, basically the censorship during the Marcos regime and the martial law era. No? So this is more of not just censorship, but also about remembrance. No? So those two are my starting questions that I'd like to ask and raise to Dr. Carl. Okay, thank you very much.
Great. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Benja. With the first one, this is why I keep on writing this because the myth has always been repeated that it's just Voltes 5, when in reality, the story, if you don't just watch Voltes 5, but all the five shows that were shown in the 1978, their storylines were the same essentially, right? This is the repeating global genre during the 1970s against a tyrant, and hence the stories would actually work within that space. And what we tend to forget is that it wasn't just Voltes 5, but all the five Robo anime were actually censored during that period. And hence, to me, the resonance to the nostalgia, not correcting the nostalgia to me, is fine, given that there is very limited evidence. The only thing we have is just the memories of the people and how they understood it, right? But it's not about a cancellation of anime, given that according to the records, when they canceled Voltes 5 and all of that block timed anime, what did they replace it with? They replaced it with these are some of these titles I don't even know because I haven't read them. I haven't watched them. Ron Ron the Flower Girl, Hanako Ron Ron, Candy Candy, of course, Astro Boy, Flying House, and Superbook. So in other words, they were just replacing it with other anime, right? And it was when you look at the titles, at least for I know that Flying House and Superbook are Christian Christian anime, so hence there's no form of violence beyond the Christian violence that you see in it. So that's one. However, I can clearly quantify it from the case of comics. Comics during that time, Filipino comics during that time was actually heavily censored to the point that a lot of Filipino comic artists actually fled from the Philippines. Now currently based in Singapore, Dengkoy Miel is actually one of these artists, and the comic industry actually imposed self-censorship on their end, given that they had experiences of this during the martial law period. So in other words, rather than be attacked by government again, what the industry did was to ensure that they were now very careful on how they're going to tread with particularly to government. So there's that influence. And hence that sort of nostalgia, at least for the and then that's sort of my question for the first question. For the nostalgia concept, as I mentioned, I'd rather that's why I'm giving all of the stories here, given that I cannot conclusively even say that the Cayetana story is correct because it was just claimed by one of the people. But what I would like to present to the body is the influence of the nostalgia, right? In history, we have what we call Pierre Noir's lieu de mémoire, what your memory is and what your remembrance of the history becomes. So their interpretation of Voltes 5 when they consumed it was essentially that it was an anti-tyrannical thing. And while history, of course, when people want to keep on writing about it, when people keep on wanting to research on it, we can unpack what the reality is. But the nostalgia is still there, right? At least it's a nostalgia that exists within their spaces. In the same way that this nostalgia did not continue with the bold sinas, and he would just interpret it in a different way. And hence, there are also people that consumed this medium and translated it in a different fashion for their end. But that's the power of culture. That's the power of this particular media. And hence, what I then would rather criticize is the concept of censorship. Wherein what you then see was if censorship was actually the problem, it was basically someone that was imposing their own cultural constructs towards the entire population by saying, oh, this is violent. When in reality, none of us actually grew up to be murderous people after watching it anyway, right? It was just a perception. And by actually preventing it, it actually then prevents a lot of cultural development on their end, cultural influences on their end, right? So and that's what that the history of culture tends to present, at least in these spaces.
Okay, so thank you for clarifying that, Dr. Carl. No? So you mentioned a while ago that it's not just a matter of which of the narratives is correct, but rather what is actually the effect or the influence of nostalgia. No? So regardless of what the real reason for the cancellation of Voltes 5 is, it's about what's more interesting is how we actually understand or consume it no? As we grow old. Okay, so thank you very much for that, Carl Sensei. So as a follow-up, I think we have some questions from the audience. Let's try to answer one of them. No, so allow me to read. This is from Mr. Donald Ilagan. No, Konnichiwa, Sensei. So my question is, why Voltes 5? Actually, that's true. No, so I remembered I heard conference they were talking also about subversion in Voltes 5, and then they say, why not Star Wars, which is also around the same time? No, this is of course Empire. No, anyway, why Voltes 5? It says we have Studio Ghibli anime or movies with strong or perhaps stronger themes such as independence, love of country. No, so why do we actually have to talk about Voltes 5, and why not, for example, the more popular anime right now, which is Studio Ghibli for the new generation? Okay, so that's the first question. And then the second one is from Attorney Lia, no? Sa San Juan. Regarding the current live action show that was presented earlier, what do you think motivated this current production? No? So, which is the indie film Blue Bustamante. Is the target audience our current young audience who may not necessarily be familiar with Voltes 5 or Tokukat or those mega robots, no? Or is it really intended to revive Voltes 5 nostalgia among those who grew up with it? So we have two questions and very interesting questions from the audience. Okay, Carl Sensei, onegaishimasu.
Thank you for the very interesting question. For the first one, why Voltes 5? Of course, we have to put it, as a trained historian, I have to put it within the context. Voltes 5 was actually shown on TV, which means it's mass market, during martial law period. So that's a very important concept that we have to place here. The other thing is, for me and Benja Sensei, we're both in Japanese studies. One of the curiosities that we have was it's part of the supposed history of anime in the Philippines. But the problem that me and my co-author in an article we've written, Dr. Fontabilia, is that the Filipinos who watched this and who have seen it are actually not necessarily currently anime fans. So, in other words,
That's true. That's true.
they were actually watching it as a cartoon. So they were consuming it like a cartoon, an American cartoon. And that was something that's curious for at least Japanese studies. From a Philippine history perspective, the context of martial law is important because we tend to forget how culture, or at least, for lack of a better term, how a low cultural product such as cartoon has the capacity to influence the next generation. So in other words, it then allows us to reassess and revalue culture. Things that our parents
Mhm.
tell us na basura yung comics na binili niyo nung bata kayo. It's going to rot your brains, right? You're wasting your money on all of this. Study math. Mga ganyan, diba? So what happens is that it's surprising that it actually does have an influence, and it actually has a resonance to us in the current period, and they're interpreting it and translating it to their capacities. Um, merchandise is it's already a thing, right? Like,
Mm, 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 mm.
selling t-shirts of it and so on. But even for a national artist to actually be inspired and then create high art for it, then allows you to now have an expanded market where you now have all of these socialites who are looking at this. Oh wow, this is like the ethos and pathos of love and whatever, and then they're like gonna buy it for udos and kabudos and millions of pesos. Yet its inspiration is actually something so simple. Right.
Mm,
And
mm,
that's
mm.
to me is something important. The difference, to continue, sorry, I'm a little bit dragging. Why not Ghibli anime movies and the current ones, Naruto and so on, is because we then have to recontextualize it again. Ghibli, depending on what you're referencing, early Ghibli, Nausicaa,
Mm, 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 mm.
and so on were not actually identified as anime then. It was still also identified as imports from the US. In the same way that the generation of Nausicaa, Valley of the Wind, would also be the generation of Robotech, Macross, and so on. We never
Yes,
thought
yes, yes.
as anime. We thought of them as cartoons. So
Mm,
hence,
mm, 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 mm.
context of it as Japanese was not yet there. But when you then talk about Ghibli, we were now imagining it as Japanese soft power. So
Exactly, exactly.
what happens, as what Doc Benji had mentioned, is it then allows us to interpret it in a different space. One paper that me and my friend are also doing now is manga s. You'll now notice that a lot of artists are drawing in manga style,
Mm,
right?
mm,
Not
mm, mm,
copying, but they're now interpreting the aesthetic that they love, and what they were consuming by that time included anime and manga, right? So you'll see it in a trend, in especially with the young artists, what they were consuming. You'll also see this in high art. In the previous talks by Phoenix as well with the artists, it's not just about the pieces that they were doing, but rather what were these artists consuming in order for them to be inspired by this work. In France, they had a
mm,
Japan
mm, mm, mm,
phenomena where you had, I think, sina Van Gogh, sina ano, that they were consuming ukiyo-e, and then they were then reinterpreting it in a European sense. So it's that interesting nuance. With the second one, this
The
is
one
all,
with Blue Bustamante, right?
I think this is it's not Bulbo Samate, but the live action of Voltes
Ah,
5.
is it? Okay, okay.
Yeah. It's great that Doc Benja actually mentioned Star Wars. Why? Because you then have the idea here of fandom. What do we mean by this? It now allows you to define and redefine fandom. For example, if you're the ones that actually watch Star Wars, not the Star Wars one. That's why you. How am I going to reference this? The Star Wars 456 ba? The original ones by Steven Spielberg.
Four, five, six. Steve,
Um,
George Lucas.
yeah, whatever. See how much of a fan I'm not. It tells you about how these are subculture consumers. They were fans of a genre that was not popular. All right.
Mm, mm, mm.
What then happens? Um, they will have kids who would then what they will then do is allow these kids to watch what their parents liked, which then, and then of course their parents would then show them what they thought were safe media, and in their case as fans they would show them 456. And what happens here is that you're no longer then having children who are seeing it as a subculture, but they were then seeing it as a culture for themselves. They're interpreting it as mass culture. Because my parents said it's okay,
Mm,
right?
mm, mm, mm,
And that's where you then have the growth of them now having 1, 2, 3. Tama, di ba? So 1, 2, 3 is now coming out. It's now part of mass culture. Um, and what you then have is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Star Wars, which is now not only part of a subculture, but also a mass culture.
mm, 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 mm.
So you have two generations. So for what Attorney Leah is then telling us, asking is, you're now looking at the third generation. Now that the market there's no longer need for a market study. They now know that this is a sellable brand. It's no longer, so it's not just echoing towards the nostalgia of the subculture fans and the
Mhm,
mass
mhm.
culture. It's now about, I'm just selling you orange juice, right? It's a safe product. And maybe I might be insulting a lot of people here. It's like the MCU, right? It's the Marvel universe. It's no longer about, oh, I used to watch the comic books of this, right? It's now
Mm,
about
mm, mm.
a safe brand to produce something and consume. In that way, they realized that the Filipinos were actually able to resonate in multiple generations of Voltas 5 fandom, and hence, why not produce a live action of it? And
Mm.
and it will definitely sell because a lot of generations will buy it, will watch it, will buy product of it, and we're going to earn more money from it. So I mean, that's how I'm seeing it from a cultural perspective.
Okay, so it's all about retranslation and then sharing this fandom to the next generation. So I
Yeah.
think this is probably also answers the question raised by Miss Cristobal. No, if introduced now, do you think Voltes 5 will resonate as much with this current generation? Would you care to give a quick response to that?
Um, yes, but the difference here is again the interpretation, right? If you have people that are clueless about its martial law history, what they would then have is they're just watching it as an anime, one Japanese anime, and two it's a robo anime. So
Mhm.
what happens is that their interpretation of it will be very very different. Like they might be inspired by the aesthetics, they might be inspired by the storyline, but they will not pick up with the historical nuances of the 1970s and the 1980s and probably the 90s.
1990s as well. Yes. Okay. Actually, there's a very good question from Mr. Domingo Gono. It says here, from the Japanese perspective of anime, no, or the aesthetics of anime, how does Voltes 5 compare to the current anime in terms of style, storyline, which have become more complex? So, how do we compare it, no, with a current anime style or those who know anime? And as a follow up to this, if I could ride on to the wonderful question by Mr. Go, are there also anime? Of course, there are very popular anime in the other parts of the world. For example, Captain Tsubasa is very popular in the Middle East, or Doraemon in Indonesia, etc., etc. Is there something very similar as well, wherein we have anime that actually had an impact, no, with the social and the political consciousness of a certain generation from another country? Would you care to answer those two concepts and ideas, please?
Oh, thank you. Actually, and that's why from a Japanese studies perspective, it is quite unusual for the Japanese to recognize that such a badly drawn anime, such as Voltes 5, became popular in the Philippines because there was between them, Grandizer Z was actually much better in storyline and art now, at least in their aesthetics. But nonetheless, this worked for us. But what it then tells you from an anime history perspective was that this was the genre that was popular. To those who to those that are familiar with anime follows popular genres. We had
Mm-hmm.
anime, we had robo anime. Currently, what's also right now is isekai anime, right?
Yes, 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 very much.
So in other words, what you then saw in the 1970s was the popularity of robo anime and the repetition. So in other words, for them, just do a robo anime, it's gonna sell well, depending on what the viewership is. Um, but what it then tells you is it tries to push the limits of consumer consumption so much so that if viewership actually slips down, then they try to change the genre. That's why we then have a lot of these experimentations. But robo anime, in terms of its skills, is still there. We do have, for those that are Gundam fans, Gundam is now an evolution of this robo anime genre.
Mm-mm.
Hence, you do see this elaborate evolution. And it tells you that it's a very popular aesthetic, given that Gundam is in its. I also shows you that I'm not a Gundam fan because I don't like it. But it has so many iterations. You'll know why it's popular because of all the Gundam toys that you see being sold in SM and Toys are in these shelves. Like all of these Gundam models that the Gunpla people are buying, right? It's
Mm-hmm.
basically an exercise of what's currently a new episode or a new season for Gundam itself. Um, for the influence of anime in various countries, you'll see that it actually, even Doc Benja had already mentioned it, Captain Tsubasa, for those that are in countries that were actually that are popular with soccer, it became their Voltes 5, right? You now have
Mm-mm.
current players, current professional players, that when you ask them what inspired them to play soccer, it was basically Captain Tsubasa. And of course, the Japanese would then say, wow, beautiful, marvelous. This is the power of Japan, without them realizing that Japanese government had no influence to this. It was basically because Japanese animation was cheap during that time.
Exactly, exactly.
Initially, they were also, Robo anime was popular, but I think for them it was Grandizer. Um, if, if and when we are able to escape from this pandemic. Their carnival in Italy would always have one of those big floats, a grandizer. Right? It's a
Mm-hmm.
now a popular traditional float for them, right? So it's going to be curious. In Indonesia, Vietnam, it's Doraemon. In
Mm-hmm.
Thailand. So you'll then see how this very simple culture is inspiring very different countries and resonating to very different countries in different way. And to us, um, it's sort of piggybacking again to the question of Sir Dennis Ata before, why Sir Donald, sorry, why Voltes 5 is because when you think of anime or when you label anime, we're already thinking about, oh, these are people that watch anime, right, otaku or something. But what makes Voltes 5 special is that it actually made non-anime consumers consume anime without us knowing it. It's the same nuance. No one's studying it because of it's a very slippery slope. I grew up on Superbook and Flying House without realizing that it's not Catholic but actually Christian in nature, right? So it becomes this very interesting study of its nuances and influences, and in different countries and different traditions.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Carl. So again, no, for the rest of the audience, thank you for your wonderful questions. No, please feel free to write your questions in the chat box, and then if you want to raise or to say your questions verbally, feel free to also use the raise hand button. Okay, so just as a segue of sorts, no, it was you mentioned a while ago that when you were planning this webinar with Phoenix, they were wondering what is the value or so what? No, why anime? No, and I think we were able to discuss it. No, it's the multiple layers of nostalgia, how it's consumed per generation, the interpretation of whether it's violence or subversion. I mean, these are very interesting points. No, and then of course when you talk about aesthetics, it's also the same. No, but just to add another dimension, no, you mentioned it a while ago that a normal lens that we use when we talk about anime, when we try to interpret it, if it's beyond the aesthetics or the literary side, is actually the concept of soft power. No, so the often gas na soft power. No, so what is soft power again? No, it's basically the power to attract rather than to coerce. No? So instead of tatakutin mo yung isang bansa by showing that you have all of these military might or economic might, you make yourself attractive. No? So and when we talk about international relations, it's also the idea of, for example, comparing Japan versus China. No? So why is Japan so attractive and why is China so attractive? So with that line of thinking, no, I'd like to ask, what is actually the impact of Voltes 5? No? What are the discernible policy or concrete outcomes that Voltes 5 has shown beyond consumption and aesthetics? Would you care to discuss this debate? No? And then, so that's one question that I'd like to ask. So it's the idea of soft power. And then there's also the question of Mr. Gomez. No? So again, we talk about comparative politics, no, and whatnot, and comparative art. Why Voltes 5 is only popular in the Philippines, no? So you mentioned about Brazil, etc., and Captain Subasa. So yeah, so would you care to elaborate on that further? So those are the two follow-up questions I'd like to raise. Thank you.
For one, it's probably not China versus Japan because that's one of the things that we're currently sort of exasperated with is because China could have actually sold us a lot of soft power with a lot of its Chinese movies, particularly as most of the probably a lot of the Phoenix members are like me, heritage Chinese. We
Mm-mm-mm.
actually be part of those that sort of allow the flow of consumption of culture, Chinese culture. I recall during my time when I was a kid, I'd watched RPN9, all of these Chinese cooking shows and so on, right? That I would not understand anything because it's not, I think, in Mandarin, but in probably Cantonese, where
Cantonese.
a lot of the production, a lot of soft power production was actually being done. We also have a lot of Cantonese movies that are just redubbed in Mandarin, Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee movies, and so on. So, but what now becomes interesting, at least resonant to a lot of you, is it's Japan versus Korea. And when we talk about it, it's
Mm-mm-mm-mm-mm.
BTS, K-pop, and so on, right? So what you then have here is what Korea was able to do is what Japan was not able to successfully do, right? The mere fact that we have BTS as UN ambassadors who are now given special circumstances to be able to travel and do their messages and so on is actually a success of how we then see, whoa, Korea, soft power, and all that. And where's Japan in this space, right?
Mm-mm-mm.
Um, Japan was supposed to be able to do this with their Olympics. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, you then see a problem in its messaging, right? To those who recently watched the Olympics and are into J games like Dr. San Jose, which I'm also not a fan of. And when all of these J game soundtracks are actually being shown and being in the Olympics, they're like a lot of my J game fans are J game fan friends are like, oh, they're showing they're singing this music in them. I'm like, what? So but it does have an influence to people that resonated to it. Unfortunately, their message was actually lost, given that a lot of criticism to Japan was because they did an Olympics in a pandemic situation, right? So so in other words, in terms of policy, we have how can soft power work? We are able to actually see it successfully for Japan with a lot of our Filipino movies, right? Kita Kita,
Mm-mm.
which is supposed to be a great Filipino movie was actually shot in Hokkaido. And after this was shown, lo and behold, you now have a lot of people, not skiers, that are now going to travel to Hokkaido. And this is part of their soft power policy, which includes tourism, right? And that's why we have, I think, an ANA flight that flies directly prior to COVID from Manila to Hokkaido itself. So you have these translations of policies. On the other hand, part of the reason, part of the soft power concept, at least in the Philippines, that why we're actually getting it is you'll notice in a couple of years before, we have a lot of French tourists here was because of
Mm-mm-mm.
ano yun? Survivor. Actually, Survivor fans actually shown here, and hence the crazy French people watching French Survivor were now like, oh, look at this tropical paradise that the Philippines has, and it created tourism. So in other words, soft power and cultural concepts are no joke.
Mm-mm.
That scenario, right? And this is sort of then related to what Sir Gomez had then questioned. What about Japan itself and other countries? Why Voltes 5 is popular to the Philippines is exactly that. The different and as I mentioned early on, if it's basically Japanese animation fans, those that watch anime, Naruto, Bleach, Demon Slayer, and so on, that are saying, "Oh, this is cool." What you're basically doing is that you're saying you're talking to fellow fans, fellow otaku, fellow like if Benja Sensei talks to me about Star Wars and so on, I'm like nice, right? But so it will not resonate to me because I'm not a fan. But what makes Voltes 5 actually popular, what makes Voltes 5 actually special is because it resonated to multiple fandoms, multiple generations, and multiple consumer markets. We're not even talking about elites. We're talking about all classes, A, B, C, D, E. When you ask people up to a point, sing Voltes 5 song, they will not, they will sing like la, 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 la. But even the tune, they already are familiar with it. So that's why it became a very popular and interesting nuance. You would imagine this same phenomena that would exist in some fandoms, um,
Mm-mm-mm.
such as Star Wars, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter, and so on. But when you further study its fandom space, it's limited to people who identify themselves as fans, right? So much so that when you talk to me about Harry Potter, I'll just say, "Oh yes, nice," right? And take note, I'm not a fan of Voltes 5. I just watched it as a kid, right?
Mm-mm-mm-mm.
So it's that nuancing that you no longer have to identify yourself as a fan. It's a cultural concept that actually exists within your space that anyone and everyone more or less is familiar with it and can engage in a conversation with you with it. Right. So there.
Okay, so thank you very much, Dr. Carl. No, so let me just wrap up a while ago. Our discussion. So, after Dr. Carl's very informative presentation, we were able to touch on and discuss further, no, the additional themes which resonate with this talk. No, so for example, there's the whole debate about violence versus subversiveness, no? And then of course the influence of nostalgia, no, of multiple generations and consumption. And then even with the idea of soft power, no, of um, what are the difference between, for example, Chinese, Korean, and the Japanese soft power initiatives, and of course the problem of messaging, no, and the concrete policies. No, so with that, I think we were able to raise, no, very interesting questions. No, so I'd like to thank the audience for your wonderful presentation. And with that, no, thank you also to Carl Sensei. I'd like to now hand over the floor back to our MC. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Ben and our speaker, Dr. Carl, and to all who sent in their questions. You know, getting deeper into what would have seemed a simple animated show allowed a peek into the mindsets, the psyche of the generations at the time and now, and why was it popular. So now I know it's about soft power, influence of nostalgia, the consumed by a greater mass, and even that low art inspires us well. As Dr. Carl mentioned once, low art influences high art, right? Yeah. So to close this afternoon's event, may we now hear from our esteemed president, Attorney Francis Lim, for his closing remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Carl, for that very enlightening and, in fact, informative session. I'm sure that our audience participants have enjoyed it. When I came in, unfortunately, I had a board meeting which started 8:30 and just was finished a few minutes ago. There were still more than 210 attendees, and that just goes to show how interested they were in your presentation. The messages beyond this this anime contain are also very interesting indeed. I'd like to thank the Arts Committee again. I think this is the nth time that the Arts and Culture Committee has given us this series of enlightening webinars. Thank you very much to the chair and to Tomeng, of course, And to the moderator, thank you for, I've been listening intently to your moderation of the show, and you gathered, you gave us a lot of insights by listing answers to your questions, and to the audience who participated in the questions. Thank you very much. Lastly, but not least, I'd like to thank our very hardworking staff led by Mike Babiluan for organizing this webinar. Maraming salamat at mabuhay tayong lahat. Stay safe, please stay safe and keep well. Unfortunately, the Delta variant is still in our midst, no? And let's just keep our fingers crossed that we remain uninfected. And for those infected, let's pray for them so that God will give them full and complete healing. And those who unfortunately pass on, we have members, Eddie Gana among them. No? Let's pray for them, and may the Lord Almighty give comfort and relief and comfort to their families. Again, maraming salamat at mabuhay ang Phoenix.
Thank you, Mr. President. But before we end, could we have the panel stay for a bit for a photo op? And to our audience, I hope your afternoon was the respite you expected. Thanks, everyone, and keep safe.
Thank you, Sonny. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Carl and Dr.
Thank
Benji.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We'll take the picture po. Hold for a while. Okay, ready? 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Francis.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Take care,
Have a good
everyone.
weekend. Bye-bye.
Have a safe
Have a nice
afternoon.
weekend.
Ito daw yung beses na magagawa mo ko yung langin. Ginawa kita isang hero.